Good evening. Thank you for tuning in to Face to Face. I'm your host, Dennis Ward. Our guest this week is the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations, Carolyn Bennett. Minister Bennett was first elected to the House of Commons in 1997. She was previously a critic for public health as well as Aboriginal affairs, and prior to her time in politics was a family physician. Minister Bennett, thanks so much for being on the show and hosting us here in your office in Ottawa.
Great to have you here.
A few weeks ago, we had the three of the four commissioners for the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls National Inquiry on the show, and they expressed what they said were many new levels of frustration with the federal government. One was the timing of the inquiry. They'd asked for an extension, and they felt that they didn't get the extension they had hoped for due to the timing of the upcoming election. Is that the case here?
I don't think so. I think that the issue was that we had always been guided by the families. A lot of the families didn't want this to go on forever, but they wanted to make sure they had the appropriate time to do a good piece of work. But we also needed the partnership of provinces and territories to make sure that the Commission would have the tools they need around subpoena and being able to really do an investigative piece of work. And at the time, it was pretty clear that we weren't going to get the approval for the extension for all of the provinces and territories. And without that, then it's no longer a national public inquiry.
Are you able to say what provinces or territories didn't want an extension and why they wouldn't go for it?
I think it's probably better that the provinces and territories explain themselves. And of course, even since then, there's been significant change in some of the governance of provinces in terms of from those that actually had the orders in council allowing the Commission to come in to maybe a different government with a different set of priorities.
Do you personally feel as though the inquiry has been rushed or could have used a bit more time?
I think that it's been very important, and I think that the kind of almost therapeutic effect of the family gatherings has been extraordinarily well received in the fact that it was trauma-informed and culturally relevant. I think the families that are participated have really been grateful for that. I think that there also has been that the family liaison units that were set up at the same time have also had a really important alternative to some of the families that didn't want to testify or to share their stories at the gathering, but have been able to navigate the system better with the help of those family liaison units. And even in this province of Ontario, there were many families that have approached the family liaison unit, but only 3 of which chose to share their stories with the Commission. So I think that again there are. I think that this is we're just hugely grateful, and I think we're very grateful that we've been able to act on a lot of the recommendations in the interim report, and that's been very, very important too.
That was one of the other concerns that they brought up, was they felt that there was a lack of action on the recommendations in the interim report.
Well, obviously, there were certain ones that were administrative that we immediately tackled with a working group that made sure that there were, the kind of administrative delays were addressed with a bi-weekly meeting from that time on. I think that we also felt that a lot of their recommendations around getting on with commemoration, getting on with dollars for healing, getting on with some of the changes in policing and the RCMP in terms of the major crime units, being able to deal with best practices. I think that at the same time in June, as we announced the extension, we were also able to announce significant investments in what they had asked for in their interim report.
So you think those actions have been acted upon? Yes,
and I think that it's been even on the bigger things like the national housing strategy, that continuum from homelessness through to being properly housed, to I think that Dr. Philpott's summit on child and family services has been very important and will lead to the kinds of things that we heard time and time again during the pre-inquiry, was that almost all of the victims and honestly the perpetrators as well had either an attachment to the child and family services system or child abuse, often both, and that by really making real significant reforms and being able to get jurisdiction back to community on child and family services has been part of Dr. Philpott's 6-point plan, and I think that's going to make a huge difference as the Commission asked us to.
Well, it was their thoughts, I guess, that they hadn't been acted upon, which also leads to a bigger concern of when the final report comes out and acting on those and ensuring that they don't just sit on a shelf collecting dust like many other recommendations before. How do you ensure that there's some action on those?
Well, I think that, again, that the things that were identified even in the pre-inquiry of things that need attention, child and family services, policing, those were to us the areas that really had been under investigated. We look forward to the Commission's advice on that. But the things like transportation and safety, like the Highway of Tears, housing, shelters, healing, to be able to actually understand the issues around the significance of the legacy of residential schools and child abuse, and how that anger, shame leads to numbing out with drugs and alcohol, or violence, suicide. These are so much of what we as a society have to deal with, and why that trauma-informed and culturally safe practice that the Commission has exemplified is brought forward into pretty well everything we do in community and with community.
Do you think there's going to be enough time to take concrete action, given the final reports coming at the end of April with the election coming?
Well, I think that we are anticipating, and as you know, the interim report was based on all of the previous reports and all the previous recommendations, and we're working very hard on that. But I also think that we will continue to make the reforms in child and family services, to be able to make the changes in policing that communities have asked for, to be able to really look at community safety in a different way. Kids aging out of the child welfare system, we, I think, are hearing a lot, even by just overhearing what the commissioners have been hearing. But I think that we will take that final report very seriously, and we'll be able to respond appropriately, and over the long term, that these changes are going to take some time to really put in effect, and until we know that Indigenous women and girls are able to walk safely in their communities, if they choose to move to urban centers, that's what we want to focus on, is how those young women, girls, women are able to be safe.
What's it going to take to see that? The inquiries crisscrossing the country, and these cases seem to be still happening every week.
Well, I think that again, that there are some common denominators that we're hearing, particularly of young women aging out of the child welfare system. If we can change that child welfare system such that communities have jurisdiction over their kids, it's heartbreaking to hear the chiefs and council and elders and women's groups, youth groups, when a child is apprehended out of the community, how they lose everything. They lose their way. And that whether it's the healthy auntie that could move into that house, or the various changes that we know can work bottom up, those are the changes we want to see, such that secure personal cultural identity of a kid feeling proud of who they are as First Nations, Inuit, Métis, that's their resilience, that's their sense of control over their own lives, and their health, education, and economic outcomes. And so that's where we have to start.
You keep mentioning child welfare, and this is more Minister Philpott's place to speak, I guess, but I was there when the emergency meeting was on. It seemed as though at the end of that you all felt that there was going to be changes coming soon. We're 10, 11 months later. Have you heard of any change?
There's lots of change happening, and I think that whether it's because it's part of what we're doing on rights recognition. So the agreement we signed with the Shuswap Nation, the agreement with the Manitoba chiefs, that this is about jurisdiction, and it's something that Dr. Philpott and I are working together on as to how we change the model from funding lawyers to apprehend children and agencies and non-Indigenous foster families. We want that money to go to kids and families and communities, and to be able to bring those kids home who've been taken from their communities, and those changes are happening already.
Minister, just have to step aside here for a quick second for a commercial break, and then we'll return here on Face to Face with Minister Carolyn Bennett. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is the Minister of Crown Indigenous Services, Minister Carolyn Bennett. And Minister Bennett, I'd like to move to the so-called federal recognition and implementation of rights framework. What is it about this legislation that the government is wanting to move forward so quickly with?
So a framework is two things. It's changes in policy, as well as deciding what needs to go into legislation. So the policies that have been criticized as long as I've been in this town, the comprehensive claim policy, the specific claim policy, inherent right policy, those have to change. And so whether it's getting rid of cede and surrender and extinguishment and all of those things, those were great deterrents to people entering the path to self-determination. On legislation, there are some things that the groups who are already self-determining, self-governing, have asked for. Changes to the Interpretation Acts in terms of non-derogation, but also the call for some better way to do dispute resolution than ending up in court every time, but also what was in 3 of the articles in the UN Declaration. There they call it treaty violation, but we've been asked to put in place a oversight body for treaty implementation that is, did Canada do what it said it was going to do when it signed an agreement? And so those are the things that the self-governing nations asked for in a letter to the government in 2014. So those are the things that we think, and we are being told they've waited long enough for. But also the Métis groups are very clear that they want some protection for the gains that they, so fought so hard for. So those are also, the Métis are pretty well saying, if nothing else, go ahead with us. And so it's the two things of the policy changes that really have to be made, because still, on the website, the claims policy sort of, I hope it says under construction, because it's not the way we're working now. Because at the tables, and what we've learned from the rights recognition tables, of which there are over 70 now, over half of the Indian Act bands are at a table, whether it's asserting jurisdiction on child and family services or on a fishery or on the 23 Anishinaabe nations here in Ontario signing an agreement on an education system, that at those tables, instead of having to go to cabinet, get a mandate, and then negotiate within that mandate, we now start with a blank sheet of paper. What would you like to talk about and in what order? and then I go to cabinet to get them what they need. And so we are kind of doing that completely differently than what's written down, and we need to get it written down.
This, just us talking about it, it is complex, and a lot of people at the community level don't exactly know what's going on here. Do you think that there should be a slowdown in this, a restarting of it?
Well, I think that what we're saying is that there are things that we need to keep moving forward on changing the approach of Canada, as the Prime Minister said in his speech in the House of Commons on February 14th. You change from a denial of rights approach, where you have to claim your rights and then go to court to prove your rights, to a recognition of rights approach. That means that if rights are recognized right from the get-go, it means we then sit down at the table and discuss sort of with our partner, how do they want to implement those rights? And we're not fighting about whether those rights exist anymore. And so I think that's a big change. And a lot of people are saying, we've been waiting for these words for a very long time. Section 35 was there, but it was viewed as an empty box of rights. And now we've met much of the legal cases and the jurisprudence building up to that full box of rights that says, no, it's time Canada just said, the rights exist. And so on any project, like in Bill 69, at the very idea of a project, if Indigenous rights are recognized, then they have to be at the table at the first idea of a project. Indigenous knowledge has to be part of the science that is used. And so that's, I think, what we're trying to move forward is this new understanding. And I guess as a physician, I think of the Canada Health Act that was only 14 pages, but no future government ever was prepared to tamper with it. And the provinces and territories actually participate in the dispute mechanism. So we hope that by Canadians participating in this time, because I think with the Royal Commission, a lot of Canadians didn't, even though the blanket exercise and all those things came out of the Royal Commission, that still this time we want to make sure Canadians understand that if the recognition and implementation of Indigenous rights was as important to them as Medicare, we actually need Canadians to understand Section 35 isn't optional. It actually is the way our government, and we hope future governments, will see and treat the people who were here first.
We're talking about rights, but that there are those who are afraid that rights and title aren't included in this, that First Nations won't be sovereign at the end of this.
Well, I think that last week in Chilcotin Territory, I sort of feel that any Canadian who was there would understand what title means. It's surrounded by mountains. That was clearly their land, and that they'd lived there for millennia. And so that is an understanding that Canadians need to have. There's other parts in Canada where title could be shared, or because people moved and there are various sort of overlaps, or even some people don't even like me using the word overlap because it means one piece of paper is closer to the desk than the other one. But we actually, I think, are really prepared to understand that the title matters, that a legal pluralism matters, and that we need Indigenous law also to be informing me and the government of Canada in the same way that common law and civil law has really throughout the history. So I think it's an exciting time where everybody is learning really how important this issue of the recognition of rights really is. So
those concerned about sovereignty with the framework should not be concerned?
We want them at the table and a lot of them are at the table. I mean, a lot of the people who have been critical are also at a table negotiating the implementation of their rights. And I feel that, just like the Prime Minister says, that everything we do now is based on the recognition of rights, respect, cooperation, and partnership. But we're very clear that it has to feel like a partnership. It can't be just watered down paternalism. And so it means that as we co-develop the way forward, that we are seriously still listening as to what's the what Professor John Burroughs calls radical practicality or radical practicalism, the art of the possible going forward. Because you know, as the Prime Minister said, we need to get this right.
Minister Bennett, I'll have to hold you there again so we can step aside for one more commercial break, and we'll be right back here on Face to Face. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is Minister of Crown, Indigenous Affairs, Relations, Minister Carolyn Bennett. And Minister Bennett, we're short on time, but I did want to ask, you were a long-time critic of INAC, and just how you feel you've done in the job here now as this term is coming to an end.
Well, I think it's exciting. It's really exciting to get to do things and to get to actually move forward on the positive things that are possible. I think I've learned that even as the critic, they have to propose, not just oppose, and that we had to stop awfulizing. There is so many amazing First Nations, Inuit, Métis leaders who know what needs to be done, and it's up to us as a government to listen and just help get it done. And so I have the best job in the country because there's the most progress to be made, but there's times when it's it's not always easy, and there's going to be critics, but I think it's exciting when we have so much to celebrate.
Has it been much more difficult when you're part of government? Are things taking longer than you would have hoped here?
Well, I think because we as a government have decided this is a whole of government piece. It's not just the Minister of Indigenous Affairs anymore. It actually is the fishery, the transport. Everyone is moving together on this recognition of rights. And so, and we have other partners, provinces and territories, municipalities. And so it's a matter of my new title of Crown Indigenous, that is sobering because we've got to move forward, but I think we are, and it feels really good.
There is one thing that you would hope to accomplish before this election unfolds. Is there something that comes to mind?
I think that we just have to continue trying to rebuild the trust. After 150 years of broken promises, we have to work every day on the journey of reconciliation that is indeed a journey, not a destination, but we have to do that every day, one day at a time.
Minister Bennett, I feel we could have spent an hour with you here, but we do appreciate you taking the time to join us here on the show. This show and all episodes are also available as a podcast. You can find those at aptn.ca/face-to-face podcast. Our thanks to the Minister, and thanks to you for tuning in to Face to Face. I'm Dennis Ward, and we'll see you next week.